My game prediction was the Tennessee Volunteers play a full great game and defeat the Alabama Crimson Tide in a great, exciting, close, dramatic, exciting game. And the game wasn't close. The game wasn't great. The game wasn't close, great, exciting. Well, the game wasn't close, great, dramatic, competitive. It wasn't any of those because the Crimson Tide they demolished the Volunteers 49-17 in a game that was a correction 48-17 in a game that was as abysmal as the score. They easily won this. This was all too easy. Crimson Tide, the juggernaut Crimson Tide, demolishing the Volunteers, the outmatched Volunteers, 48-17 in a game that was as abysmal as the score. The game was exciting, just not in the way I wanted it, because Crimson Tide were basically like the St. Louis Rams' greatest show on turf, since they scored 28 points in the first half, and they outscored the Tennessee Volunteers in both the first half and in the second half. They outscored the Tennessee Volunteers in both the first half and the second half. And they scored 6 touchdowns before the Tennessee Volunteers defense finally started holding them to field goals, 2 field goals to be exact. So that came very late. And why was this exciting? Because you got to see the Alabama Crimson Tide's offense, which was, including the ground and pound, their offense was an onslaught, both in the first half and the second half. Mainly the first half, and also the second half, because they scored 2 touchdowns and then moved the football and they did get to hold the 2 field goals, but you still got to see those 2 touchdowns before those 2 field goals. So their offense was an onslaught. Nick Saban had the angry reaction. The game went from bad to worse as expected. That most Volunteers fans were fearful of what happened in the second half, and they gave them that hot garbage entertainment, mainly with the fact that there was a created fumble. A Crimson Tide defender, the same one that created the fumble, picks up the football and easily runs into the end zone for a touchdown. And Garantano showed effort, except he wasn't able to tackle the Crimson Tide defender, and he saw that he just gave up. I could see why he gave up, because once he would have been able to tackle the Crimson Tide defender, he would have already been in the end zone. So I'm like, he's going to stop running and not risk injuring himself. So I don't blame him at all for deciding to just stop running, just the fact that he saw by the time he would have actually tackled him, he would have already been in the end zone. So don't blame him at all for stopping running and avoiding an injury. And Volunteers, they did have some, very, very, they had bright spots in this game, except it really didn't matter. They did have bright spots in this utterly depressing 48-17, and I say that because they moved the football. They were held to a field goal. I know they were held to a field goal, but they still moved the football and moved the football. They weren't able to get a touchdown, except they still were successful because they kicked the field goal, made the field goal. Again, they moved the football, except this time better, because they, down 21-3, they moved the football, score a touchdown with a long pass. Garantano throws a long pass for a touchdown. Successful. Volunteers showing some fight, signs of life, gave me slight optimism that they would be able to make this game close, competitive, except I was right to be slightly optimistic, because Crimson Tide showed, nope, this is not going to be a competitive, close game, and they just moved the football easily and increased the lead back again to 3 possessions. They increased the lead to 28-10. And then in the second half, it just got worse, because it looked like I had some slight optimism maybe the Volunteers would be able to make it a better second half. Started moving didn't matter, they were moving the football, because that's when the fearful, this turnover is going to happen, got the Crimson Tide benefit from it in the best way possible with the fumble, return for a touchdown to pretty much put the game mostly out of reach because it's 35-10, and Tennessee Volunteers do not have the great offense where they could come back from 25 points to defeat a great team, including a great Alabama team. So that mostly put the game out of reach because the Volunteers' offense is not that kind of great arsenal where they can come back from that amount against a great team. Even if they're at home, it doesn't matter because they don't have that kind of great arsenal. And also, again, they moved the football and then scored a touchdown to what was a long pass by Garantano. So he did show fight. Yeah, he did show fight, except so that was a successful pass by Garantano, and so the Volunteers did have bright spots in this game, except it really didn't matter because they were losing by 3 possessions, and even when those happened when they were losing by 3 possessions, instead of happening when they're only losing by 1 possession or 2 possessions, which would have made it maybe just slightly more likely that this game could have been close and competitive. And also, besides that, there was also some of the other Volunteers' defense could have just easily quit because they already gave 28 points in the first half. So I'm like, well, they could have just easily quit, except they didn't, which is why they were able to create a fumble and recover that fumble. Now, obviously, the Volunteers' offense they weren't able to benefit from it. So hang that on the offense, but it's great to see that the defense, they didn't take the easy way out when they could have just easily, because they already gave up 28 points. They were embarrassed, but they didn't quit. They didn't take the easy way out. They didn't start using the easy action because of getting exposed mainly in the first half and continue to get exposed in the second half. They continue to compete, continue to try to make it at least slightly more likely that Volunteers could at least make this game watchable. Volunteers' offense wasn't able to take advantage because Crimson Tide's defense is great. Even with at least a decent field, they weren't able to move the football, get into field goal range, or get it into like the red zone. So understood why the Volunteers weren't able to take advantage of that turnover, because Crimson Tide defense is great, and they were able to successfully. They didn't have to be a bend don't break. They just nope, they're not going to move the football, and they didn't. Volunteers' offense wasn't able to move the football when needed most. And Volunteers' defense, even after being hugely embarrassed, having given up 6 touchdowns, they were still finally able to hold the Crimson Tide to 2 field goals. Now, I know this came after they gave up 6 touchdowns, except, again, more evidence that they didn't quit. They didn't use the easy action to quit. And that's why I'd say it's highly depressing, because this is a team that didn't quit, except when they were getting these benefits, including holding the Crimson Tide to 2 field goals, that was happening after they gave up 6 touchdowns. When they were scoring these points, including when they're scoring those 2. When they scored those 2 touchdowns, long touchdowns, they were already losing by 3 possessions. So these were coming at the very, very highly inconvenient times. So they were showing signs of life, except it doesn't matter they were showing signs of life because they put themselves in position where they're not likely to come back. So it would have been more convenient if they would have done this down 1 possession, or done this before Alabama scored. So the game was highly depressing to watch, and I was only being entertained by it because I wanted to see how much worse is this game going to get, and are they going to continue to compete even when it's obvious they're not going to come back and win. So I was still entertained by it just by seeing how much worse is this game going to get. Are they still going to compete? And how much longer until Garantano gets replaced, which he did. And obviously, I was hugely wrong about Alabama almost doubled what I had them predicted for scoring, because I had them predicted for scoring 28 points, and they almost double what I predicted since they scored 40. I had them predicted for scoring 28, and they scored 29, 30. Yeah, they came close to scoring double what I had them predicting, since I had predicted they scored 28 points and they scored 48 points. So that's not 28 point. That's not double of 28 points, but that's still 20. So that's 8 short of what I predicted them to score. Like, that's 20 more points of what I predicted them scoring. So that's highly embarrassing. Tennessee Volunteers only like scored 50% of what I predicted them to score. So I wouldn't call that completely embarrassing, but I would still say that's slightly kind of, I mean, that's less depressing, but still embarrassing because of, it's still 50% of like 17 of those like 34 points. So I guess that's just slightly less depressing. And this was just another dime a dozen, exactly what I was fearful of, that they would be. Ever since Nick Saban's taken over the Crimson Tide, it's just common that Volunteers are not able to hang around with the Crimson Tide. They're not able to keep the game close, and this was just more of the same. Now, I would have still been depressed if the Volunteers didn't. A still rebuilding Volunteers team still would have like not defeated the Crimson Tide, but I would have been just maybe slightly less depressed if they actually kept the game competitive and watchable, because this was just a dime a dozen. They were outplayed in the first half. The game's not watchable. They were outplayed in the second half. The game's not watchable, which has just been the entire story. Anytime Tennessee Volunteers have played the Saban Crimson Tide. So it's going to be a long. I'm highly happy if this just gets like, shows that maybe there are more necessary changes needed for the Tennessee Volunteers. Except also if this game happened before the bye week, just so that the Tennessee Volunteers don't have to have this game after the bye week, where this makes this like the narrow of the season that is like not going to be as long as it was, like as 12 games. Like this season could be like less depressing, because it seems like they've already gotten those like gauntlet embarrassing games out of the way. I mean, I don't say they have a cakewalk for the rest of them, but they've already played Georgia before their bye week, which was a highly depressing game. And they've already played Alabama, which is also an even more depressing game. So I would imagine that even if they do lose other games during the season, that they can still make it more manageable, and they're not going to have another highly depressing Alabama and Georgia game for the rest of the season. And now they could still like lose other games in the season, but I don't imagine they're going to have another, this is as terrible as the Alabama game, this is as terrible as the Georgia game, because they've already played what I got no doubt at all are their two most challenging teams. And right now, expected Auburn to be like still at least like a great team, except right now they're not ranked. I mean, they're still playing at least effective, but they're not ranked, so that game looks just slightly more winnable. And I'm excited to see if they can actually get united by this adversity and actually salvage the season, since they got the bye week at the exact right time that they needed it most, much like last season. Go Rocky Top Volunteers, show a better regroup and play better for after that bye week. I hope they can.